It's okay, because I can't move it. I can't, Thank you. Hello, everyone. Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second colloquium of the academic year. It's great to see all of you. And today we will have David Bindman deliver his colloquium. But before then, let me say it is my delight and honor to welcome a longtime friend of the Hutchins Center, Rita Fried. She was Associate Professor of Art at the University of Memphis and founding director of the Institute of Egyptian Art and Archaeology there before coming to the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston. At Boston, she headed up the Department of Ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern Art, a position that she now holds as Emerita. She teaches Egyptian and Nubian art at Wellesley College, all the while pursuing research in Nubian art and developing materials to make it more widely available. Dr. Fried has excavated in Egypt at numerous sites from the Delta to Konarak, as well as in Israel and Cyprus. The exhibitions she has curated and co-curated include Egypt's Golden Age, A Divine Tour of Ancient Egypt, Ramesses the Great, Pharaohs of the Sun, The Secrets of Tomb 10A, and Ancient Nubia Now. Her book on Nubian art is forthcoming from the Getty Museum Press. Please welcome Rita Fried.
Well, thank you, Krishna. It is a delight to be back here. I spent a couple of years ago as a fellow here, and I can honestly say it was one of the most fantastic experiences of my life. So I'm very pleased always to come back to these great lectures. So introducing David Bindman with some brief words is a tall order. It's not that introducing him is a tall order, but doing it briefly is the challenge. And quite frankly, I really don't know where to start. I will say that I met him some years back in conjunction with a Hutchins program, and I thought of him at first as a quiet, polite, and very English person. But now, I think of him as a true polymath and Renaissance man who is anything but quiet. I am awed by the depth of his thinking, the breadth of his knowledge, the number of his publications and awards, and his humility about all of them. So let me begin to tell you what I see as the highlights of his 50-plus career in art history. He received his PhD from the Courtauld Institute in London with a specialty in British art. His thesis on William Blake as an artist not only became a book, but also an exhibition. And then he moved on to Hogarth, likewise a book and an exhibition. From two-dimensional material, he went on to sculpture, and his next book, entitled Roubiliac and the 18th Century Monument, went on to win the Mitchell Prize, which I'm told is the art historical equivalent of the Nobel Prize. Not bad. And I could go on and on and on. But I think what we all recognize him for is his republication, editing, and compilation, together with Skip, of the originally 8-volume Image of the Black in Western Art. Since its total revision and republication in 2012, he's expanded this amazing series to include The Image of the Black in Africa and Asia, which came out in 2017, and The Image of the Black in Latin America and the Caribbean, not one but 2 volumes, which I am told is expected in a few months. He's currently working on the last volume in this fabulous series in conjunction with Professor Suzanne Blier, who is here today. This is The Image of the European in African Art, something I'm really looking forward to. I didn't tell you that he is an emeritus professor in the history of art at University College, where he headed the department for a number of years. And if I were to tell you all the places where he's been a visiting fellow, you would not hear his lecture, you wouldn't have time. So let me conclude by saying in his own words, and I quote, "In the 1990s, my work turned toward issues of both representation of race and nationality, but also toward the relationship between art and the history of ideas. The underlying theme being the desire to lead the history of art beyond a narrow consideration of objects into the wider intellectual world." Today, the title of his talk and his book is appropriately "Race is Everything." So it is indeed an honor and a pleasure to introduce a colleague and a friend, Professor David Bindman.
Well, thank you very much, Rita. Rita is the very model of the kind of colleague one acquires at the Hutchins Centre over the years. And so much of what I've got to say today and say in the book was entirely due to conversations with other fellows over now a total of 17 years. And of course, a lot of those fellows have become friends, like Rita. I could simply name dozens of people who've contributed to what I've done up to now, but I just want to mention one, and that's my friend Lewis Wilson, who was Professor of History at Smith College, who died last year. Again, I want to thank the staff here. Of course, Skip is a dominant figure in my work, and Sheldon, Krishna, Abby, Velma, and everybody else here. Now, this is, in fact, though it's not quite advertised as such, a book launch, and there are copies out there which I will sign free of charge. To anyone who wants them. But no pressure, no pressure. Now, what I want to do today, it's quite a long book, as you'll see. I obviously don't want to summarize it, but I want to begin by outlining the premises of the book and then focus on what to me was one of the most surprising discoveries in writing it, which is, and one of the reasons I'm so pleased Rita is here is it's about ancient Egyptian art. I argue that, hold on, let me get... I argue that European ideas of race are based on visual difference, and that is true from its first definition by the 18th century naturalist Linnaeus, who began by classifying plants and animals, then humanity. Race in its essentials is based on the idea that a person's exterior can be correlated with her or his interior character. In its earliest pre-racial manifestation, the dark skin of a person of African descent is made to indicate a dark character, just as the light skin of a person of European descent denotes the opposite. This goes against an equally traditional belief that appearances can be deceptive. This dichotomy can be seen in two panels from an early 17th century painted closet, which is now in the museum in Ipswich in Suffolk in the UK. And I thought I'd show you the whole of the thing, which means you don't get a very good idea of the precise contents, but in each panel consists of a Latin epigram on a scroll and a painting illustrating it. A black man smoking a pipe has the epigram "Intus idem," the same inside, which suggests that a person of black skin is necessarily black in character. This, of course, also references the Christian tradition of associating whiteness with cleanliness and moral purity, and blackness with evil and the devil. In another painted panel, a white gentleman measures his own forehead with a pair of compasses, accompanied by the epigram "Fronti nulla fides," or "no trust in the forehead or face." This suggests that outer appearance is not a trustworthy way of revealing character. Looks, in other words, can deceive. Or, as a hospital administrator said recently on being told that a fresh-faced nurse whose face had been used on publicity posters had murdered newborn babies in her care, "You can't tell a book by its cover." The idea that the exterior gives insight into the interior life is the first of the fallacies on which racial ideas are built. But one should not underestimate the idea's power from the late 18th century to the present age. Johann Caspar Lavater, in the last years of the 18th century, demonstrated exhaustively that the aesthetic appearance of a person was connected to their level of virtue or vice. A beautiful face implies a beautiful soul, an ugly one a tendency to wickedness, an idea inherited from antiquity, and one that still lingers in celebrity culture. How could reputable scientists of the time justify such an obviously absurd connection between virtue and beauty and immorality with ugliness? Lavater claimed that the exercise of virtue had a direct physical effect on the shape of the head. The smiling virtue of a good person would be reflected in the countenance, just as the bitter exercise of malevolence would cause the skull to form the face into a permanent sneer. In the engraving of Judas, after a painting by Holbein, the apostle's treachery is expressed in the shape of the skull in such a powerful way that it became a classic stereotype of Jews into the Nazi era. According to the pioneering anthropologist George Cuvier, an educated white person would generically have a larger skull, the visible shape of which is conditioned by the brain, which acts like a kind of muscle that expands to fill and extend the space, and thus enable the exercise of intellect and imagination. If, on the other hand, a person has a black or brown skin, he believed with equal conviction that they had a skull that is smaller with a lower forehead, a sign of a constricted brain within that cannot expand freely, thus limiting the person's intellectual capacity, a forerunner of the idea of arrested development. It hardly needs saying that there's no scientific basis for this, nor is there any connection between brain size, intellect, and moral capacity. Equally fallacious is the idea that a judgment of a person's character from their appearance applies to all that share the same skin color or head shape, and can be supported by skull measurement. This was first proposed by the well-meaning Dutch physician and artist Peter Camper in the 1790s, who claimed that these attributes apply not only to individuals, but to all people who constitute a race, on the assumption that humanity is divided into only 4 races. All Europeans have an identifiable skull shape that could be measured against Africans and others. From then on, it was taken for granted that the racial difference could be tabulated with accuracy, though with hindsight, it was based on such tiny numbers of skulls that such distinctions were meaningless. The idea that there's a common skull type across the whole of Africa, for instance, is clearly nonsensical. The measurement of skulls led to each race being placed on a scale based on appearance and culture, from the superior race, always assumed to be represented by an educated white European, or by an image of the Greek god Apollo, to the inferior races defined by smaller skull capacity. This created a belief that the physical hierarchy of races was synonymous with a cultural hierarchy, from the civilized to the savage, or from the human to the animal. The Europeans always assumed to be the most developed, while Africans or Fuegians or other people deemed inferior are closer to the animal kingdom. Then there is the representational fallacy, that a drawing, painting, or print or sculpture of a human being of whatever period is an exact representation of that person. In other words, images of people are entirely unmediated by the artists or the conventions of the period in which it was made. 19th century racial scientists argued that races were made permanent from the earliest humanity by using images from ancient art to argue that the facial features of ancient Egyptians, Jews, and Africans were unchanged even to the present day. This idea is beautifully satirized in this 1955 New Yorker cartoon used by Ernst Gombrich as an introduction to the problem of period style in art in illusion, which shows ancient Egyptian artists as if they were present-day art students drawing a model in front of them. It is hard to understand, in retrospect, the certainty which eminent scientists and scholars adopted these self-serving fallacies in the 19th century. They believed, often passionately, in evidence-based scientific objectivity, but they subscribed almost without exception to a particular construction of history, largely derived from the study of ancient works of art. Ideas of relative beauty and levels of civilization, which were so important for the classification of races, rested on a belief in the superiority of ancient Greece, while ancient Egypt offered a vast archive of images of different races from the very first human civilization. What role did artists play in the development of race? The artists of museums, quite a large part in creating stereotypes and making slavery look benign, but as Dominique de Menil, the founder of the Image of the Black in Western art series, claimed, the greatest artists like Velázquez and Rubens produced paintings of Africans of such humanity that they transcend racial difference. But popular caricatures and advertisements from the late 18th century onwards were instrumental in disseminating and elaborating racial stereotypes with horrifying consequences. Camper's racial hierarchy was directed at artists to enable them to represent different races accurately, but his method of identifying racial profiles became an integral part of art school teaching well into the 20th century. It is telling that the first head in Camper's sequence is not of a European, but of the Apollo Belvedere, an example of ideal Greek beauty, and the appropriation of the Greek ideal as essentially European is a feature of all European racial theories, and the connection was only strengthened by the adoption, sometimes even claiming direct descent in the northern countries, especially England and Germany. It's worth saying, I think, that the far as we know, the Greeks did not identify themselves as Europeans, nor indeed did they think of themselves as white. But that's another lecture. Sorry. The claim of aesthetic superiority was a defining feature of all claims to Anglo-Saxon racial superiority in England and the US, and to Aryan superiority in the Third Reich. I show G.F. Watts's Sir Galahad, a version of which is in the Harvard Art Museum, while the prime version is in the entrance to Eton College Chapel, where it was meant to inspire the boys to heroic virtue. Clearly a triumph of wishful thinking, if we think of one recent example. Anyway, I'll keep Boris Johnson out of this, I think. My book is focused mainly on the 19th century, but ends with a series of case studies in the 20th century. Though it mainly looks at racial ideas that apply to those of African and Jewish descent, much of the emphasis is on the effect of familiar racial constructions, like the Anglo-Saxon and Germanic races and their artistic fruits. Rather than summarize the book, I want to look today mainly at an episode that to me was most surprising as I worked on it. One thing I'd not bargained for when I started writing was the enormous importance of ancient Egypt, which became, among other things, an intellectual battleground for the racial politics of the American Civil War. Why ancient Egypt? It was believed to be the most ancient civilization, but above all, it was rich in images of its peoples, especially of its racial types, which provided prototypes for present-day races. As Robert Knox, the author of Races of Men and the most out-and-out racist of the 19th century, wrote, "On the tombs of Egypt, the most valuable of all existing records, there stands the Negro, the Jew, and Copt, the Persian, the Sarmatian, nearly as we find them now." Ancient Egyptian art provided the materials for proving that the races now existing had an unchanging history going back to the earliest humanity. And of course, a lot of the people who believed in this also believed that ancient Egypt came into existence within a few years of the actual creation of the world. The founder of the North American School of Ethnology was Samuel Morton, a great collector of skulls, which are now in the Philadelphia Museum. He devised a method of classifying racial skulls by filling them with seeds and weighing them on the understanding that European skulls contain much larger brains than inferior races. This he proved to his own satisfaction, but it was in opposition to a German scientist, Friedrich Tiedemann, who used an identical method and came to the conclusion that there was no difference in weight between European and African skulls. And this is a story you get time and again of an overwhelming preponderance of belief in what is actually nonsensical, and just occasionally someone inadvertently tells the truth. This injection of reality made no impression on Morton's successors, the infamous Knott and Glidden, authors of Types of Mankind, 1854, dedicated to Morton and with an essay by the Harvard luminary Louis Agassiz. This volume of over 700 pages, with its subtitle, which I quote, "Based upon the ancient monuments, paintings, sculptures, and crania of races," became a Confederate Bible because it used the evidence of ancient Egyptian physiognomy to argue that the original civilized society was based on the racial difference between the white Egyptians and their slaves, the black Nubians, from further south in Africa, and this was replicated in the most modern society, the United States. It goes without saying this view was based on a number of dubious assumptions, beginning with the fallacy that ancient Egyptian heads were objectively depicted by the artists. Then there was the skin color and skull shape of the ancient Egyptians. The scholar Pritchard, following Herodotus, had already argued that, I quote, "this nation had the distinguishing marks of the African race." But Norton Glidden, following Morton, concluded that the ancient Egyptians were white and Caucasian and not really African, though it exists within the continental mass of Africa. Furthermore, the Nubians, though they were undoubtedly dark-skinned, were very far from being an undifferentiated mass of slaves. The relationship between ancient Egypt and Nubia was rich and complex, and I owe this entirely to Rita, with over many centuries one or the other of the dominant power. The pharaohs of the 25th dynasty were Nubian themselves, and there are endless shifts in the power dynamic between the two peoples. It was Frederick Douglass who gleefully demolished Norton Glidden's case by pointing out that the ancient Egyptians were likely to be as varied in color as African Americans in the present-day United States. He confronted the ethnologists by name in a printed lecture, Claims of the Negro Ethnologically Considered, delivered to the literary societies of Western Reserve College in 1854. He notes sarcastically, and I quote, that Egypt is in Africa. Pity that it had not been in Europe or in Asia, or better still, in America. He accuses Morton and Nott and Glidden of assuming that their own prejudice towards blacks was exactly comparable to that in the ancient world. In the end, for Douglass, it is art and its misuse that enables the ethnologist to make an absolute contrast between black and white peoples. By drawing attention to a double-page illustration in Nott and Glidden, he argues, and I quote, that the European is drawn in harmony with the highest ideals of beauty. And there you've got the Apollo Belvedere representing the European. And dignity and intellect, while the Negro appears with features distorted, lips exaggerated, forehead depressed, and the whole expression of the countenance made to harmonize with the popular idea of Negro imbecility and degradation. And I think that's very well expressed in the contrast between these two pages in Nott and Glidden. What this suggests is that Douglass had a highly unusual, if not unique, understanding for his time of the mediated nature of visual representation. This accounts for his own use of photography, using his own physiognomy to counter the stereotypes imposed upon black people, but also his highly prescient understanding of how racial science makes it almost impossible for current artists to avoid them. And I quote, "Negroes can never have impartial portraits at the hands of white artists. It seems to us next to impossible for white men to take likeness of black men without most grossly exaggerating their distinctive features. And the reason is obvious. Artists, like all other white persons, have adopted a theory respecting the distinctive features of Negro physiognomy." And I think this is the most important sentence in my book, because Douglass makes this connection between racial science and representation. He does the whole job for me in one sentence. I have much more to say about the role of ancient Egyptians in the formation of 19th century racism. There is a discussion of the African American approach to ancient Egypt, which is involved by contrast with Knott and Glidden, which involved identification with the children of Israel as captives of the pharaohs. There is also a chapter on eugenics and the role played in it by the great archaeologist Flinders Petrie, who was commissioned by Francis Galton, the inventor of eugenics, to photograph racial heads from Egypt. And I should say with some shame that both Flinders Petrie and Galton were professors at University College, and when I lectured until recently at UCL, I would actually lectured in the Galton Lecture Theatre, which was also, and there was also a Pearson Lecture Theatre, and he was even worse than Galton, but again, that's another lecture again. So Flinders Petrie was commissioned by Francis Galton, the inventor of eugenics, to photograph racial heads from Egypt. Ancient Egypt is only one strand in the book, which also looks at the relationship between the representation of physiognomy and the racial body, arguing that emphasis on the latter acted as a kind of antidote to racial science. But just to go back to the image on the screen, which is taken from a very rare book that was edited by Flinders Petrie, commissioned by Galton, and it's called Racial Photographs from Ancient Egypt, published in 1887. I've tried to look at a copy of this book. I've never been able to. There's not a single copy of it in Great Britain, as far as I can tell. There may be one or two in this country, and there is one in Germany, which fortunately is online. And the reason was you had to write to the printer who lived in Beckenham, somewhere in South London, and you could buy copies from him, but clearly not a lot of people actually did. But so not even the Petrie Museum in UCL has a copy. There are sections on Darwin and aesthetics and on Degas' visit to New Orleans, where I draw out the implications of his family's connections to Haiti and his own resistance to painting black subjects, despite his open fascination with New Orleans' recently liberated black population. There's also, and obviously with I did this with some trepidation, there's a brief discussion of W.E.B. Du Bois, which argue for his absorption of eugenic ideas in, for instance, The Talented Tenth, and the spread of racist imagery through new technologies of reproduction. Underlying all the work that I've done is at least a partial explanation of the continued presence and strength of racism in Western countries, despite the absurdities of its claims, and why it keeps popping up again and again in popular and political discourses. I would argue that it is able to sustain itself through memories of its great days in the 19th century, when the most admired scientists like Georges Cuvier took for granted racial tropes that give form to the most outrageous and unfounded prejudices. Its glory days are happily over, but as the old song says, the melody lingers on. Thank you very much. Right, questions?
Yes, any questions or comments?
Comments?
That was fabulous. Thank you so much. I can't wait to get my copy for it. So a point. I get two? One is we have our own. Charles Eliot was the head of international eugenics, and this is something that many of us have been thinking about how we ultimately address this, both at Harvard and in the city of Cambridge itself. We've got Elliott Bridge, among other things. And it goes, in my mind, also to the differences between our various museums here and what gets placed in what museum and how we differentially view the works in these various places. And I think that's another dimension of this. But in one of the early images you showed from 1791, I'm thinking about the ways in which the era of illumination and encyclopedias helped to shape not only what was important, but also the divisions between this. And at the same time that we're thinking about an array of questions about knowledge, we're also setting up the divisions by which race is being determinative of enslavement and other categories. So we keep going back to the Enlightenment, in essence, as a source of all good hierarchies, but it is an era in which so much of this is also being transformed. And just wondered if you wanted to address that a little bit more.
Well, I mean, I think that it's true in England, it's true over here, that so much of culture and institutions is caught up and somehow imprinted with slavery and with race. I mean, I recently had some medical problems. I was examined by the Galton professor of not of genetics, not of eugenics, slight shift of name, but he again was quite upset that I, was going to write, told him that I was writing about Galton, and he was very nervous about this and immediately launched into a defense of Galton. I think this is a problem that you've got everywhere, and of course Elliott Bridge, well, you can take the name off a bridge, you don't want to pull the bridge down. I think this is rather a good image in a way, that changing names is easy, and the Galton Lecture Theatre is no longer, I don't know what it's called now, but I think just given a number. That's the easy part, but it's much more difficult when they are involved in other things and still have some kind of force. And again, I wouldn't want to pronounce about the Department of Eugenics or Genetics in UCL, which is clearly and very plainly descended from its forebears. But then, it is a new world, and I think it is possible to talk about eugenics without with genetics without talking about eugenics. I think you just have to be endlessly alert and constantly aware of these things, and it's very important, I think, that this is taught at every level, that you don't want to judge a book by its cover. I mean, that's really the point, I think. And I mean, I know the problems around Harvard. I know there's a big commemoration of Agassiz on the Harvard Art Museum. I think it's gone now, hasn't it? I haven't looked up, but he lived there. But he's someone who was very plainly involved in the most direct way in racial science, and in the most prejudiced way too. Yes. So, but we've all got those, all academic institutions. I think the other thing that one should also remember, that every university of any distinction, and that includes Harvard, UCL, everybody, all had museums of race, in which they had skulls, bodies, often living skeletons, all of which made racial comparisons. And there were large departments in every one of them as well, with huge amounts of data gathered Apparently in Berlin there are huge archives related to the going back to the 19th century of racial statistics and measurements. So we have this legacy, and I think the question is whether we actually expose it and talk about it, which I really think we should. I think it's our absolute duty to do so and not hide it and deny it at all. But it will require a considerable amount of effort and commitment to bring these things out.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was just thinking while you were talking how the histories of the theological interpretations of virtue as linked with beauty is how those histories, people who invested in that created a science out of it, and eventually it's become a part of culture and a part of traditions and how people, historically at least, sort of differentiate different races. Now, my question is, to what degree do you think that has changed in modern times? Because virtue linked to beauty is now sort of expanded to not just beauty and virtue, but also likability. So my question is, do you think that the language that was utilized back, historically, do you think that that has changed? To what degree has it changed significantly, or has it just transformed? And in what way has it transformed?
Well, that's quite a difficult question. I think it certainly lingers on. It certainly transformed, I think, and I think celebrity culture does tend to want to keep that connection between goodness and beauty, and I think that is very much part of Western civilization, and I think to some degree we're stuck with that. It's going to be hard to get rid of all traces, and I think in general getting rid of all traces of racial thinking is going to be almost impossible, because it gets in so, into almost everything that one ever talks about. But I think, to be more optimistic about it, I think we can at least understand that, and we can say, right, this is what we're doing, this is what this is, and we can then identify it. I think that's probably as much as we can hope for in a lot of cases. But I think we've, got to, preserve some kind of hope that we can at least control it.
Thanks for your presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why this turn back to ancient Egypt in the 19th century. Specifically in terms of what's happening in Egypt in the 19th century. My understanding is that these, so-called scientists are really benefiting from new settler colonial regimes, new forms of imperialism. Yes. This is a place, pillaging of tombs, like interest in using mummies literally as a form of fuel and energy production. So if you could maybe talk a little bit, and also artists go there, right? And these ethnologists depend on the images that are being produced of people in that region. So I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more about how this interest in turning back to ancient Egypt is kind of grounded in what's happening in the 19th century.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question, and I think Rita would be more qualified to answer it, really, in the terms you suggest. But, clearly, the point about Egypt is that not only, at least it was identified, not really correctly, as the first civilization, and of course there's a continuity from Egypt through to ancient Greece. But also, people were certainly looting and moving into Egypt in a very large way, and things suddenly became familiar. And one of the things that's always astounding about ancient Egypt is the sheer profusion of materials. I mean, just simply, you know, if you go to the British Museum, there's millions of things, and bottom of MFA, anywhere you go, you've got huge collections of ancient Egypt. So it was very familiar and easily accessible, and I suppose to a degree easily lootable and buyable as well, yes. So it is very much part of, yes, the imperial expansion, yes.
I might also add the Napoleonic expedition to Egypt and the first widely available publication, the Description of Egypt, with these phenomenal prints of the monuments, and then not only that, but German expeditions and so forth. So for the first time, you could actually see what this material was, and it led to a whole wave of Egyptomania in Europe. Furniture, little knickknacks featured pseudo-Egyptian motifs. So there was great interest, and also there was an would it tie in with the increased travel by steamship?
Yes,
also?
yes.
The opening
certainly.
of the Suez Canal.
Yes,
So
yes.
all of a sudden,
Cook's tours as well, yes.
Egypt became the place, and Egypt was the Bible. And German scholars made sure that Egypt was a Mediterranean culture as opposed to an African culture.
Thank you, David, for the wonderful presentation. I'm just curious about your analysis of Black and Jewish images, kind of analyzing that alongside each other.
Yes.
I think that's a really interesting point of view, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that,
Yes.
specifically kind of what it reveals, that analysis reveals or conceals.
Yes, I mean, that's, obviously one of the problems with a subject like this is it's so enormous, and I felt I had to confine it to, well, first of all, to looking at white racism and Anglo-Saxonism, but also looking at the victims of racism. I felt I couldn't simply span, all of it. And the point about, again, blacks and Jews is that there is a kind of, they are very different, and in fact completely different. And it's not at all clear that or it's certainly not universal that the Jews constituted a race at all. And that really only comes in the mid to late 19th century, and not always very completely then. But again, the terms in which they're used, in which they're discussed, again, make a very interesting contrast with the way that Africans are discussed. So I thought I'd use those as the, if you like, the twin pillars, one being nothing straightforward in any of this at all, but at least there is a general agreement that Africa does constitute, or Africans constitute a race, or maybe several races, but the Jews are much more ambiguous in every way, and there's particularly for art, there's a very great problem is, can you argue that Jews have a phenotype, or do they actually have identifiable visual correlatives as Africans were believed to do? And that's affects art in a very powerful way, in all sorts of different ways. So it raises a whole lot of other issues that are quite separate from the racialization of Africans.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Listening to it, I was it made me think around, when you said race is everything, I was trying to think about from whose perspective this is, in terms of, are you speaking to me as an African, or are you speaking as a European, in the sense of race is everything for Europeans, right? And I could understand from your presentation that that was the point. But I think what was interesting for me, and I think the way in which it's framed, it sort of speaks about art as ancient art, something that happened in the past, and so scholarship at that time. But then when I think about development and scholarship in development, it is art. It is telling stories that I can never recognize about Africa or about my people. And so for me, that is also art. But I think what is interesting about your work, and maybe that's something that we can all think about, is in terms of how we sort of put those scholars at that time as racists. And in many ways, I feel like they also had an audience, and an audience that really believed. And so who is the audience today that is believing that development and the art in development is fair art, in the sense of that was fair art to that particular audience? And so I wonder if when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about audiences and also not making judgment, because when we make judgment of people then, what are we doing to people now? Who is going to judge the people today about what they're doing in the same way that we are making judgment on those racist scholars of that time?
Well, I mean, yes. Well, let me just say something about the title. The inverted commas are obviously essential. I'm not saying race is everything. I don't believe that anyway, obviously. But it's something that two people said repeatedly. The first is Robert Knox, who wrote this book on Races of Man, in which he argues that race is literally everything. Every conflict of any kind is, between different races. He sees, the Kentish races against the Surrey races and so on, and makes it a category that's infinitely divisible and all-encompassing. But the interesting thing also about Robert Knox is that he was not an imperialist, and he was, spoke very strongly against the occupation of Africa, exploitation of Africa, and so on. So he's an equivocal figure in that sense. The other person who says race is everything is Benjamin Disraeli, who was, well, what is he? All sorts of things. A novelist, and parents were Jewish, and he eventually became prime minister. You must think it's a very strange country that has Boris Johnson and Benjamin Disraeli as prime minister. But anyway, there we are. I suppose they were certainly expecting to have some kind of audience. I think Disraeli is much more speculative because he has a huge, elaborate construction in which he makes all sorts of different people come in within the same race, and it's, I think, not really a very serious idea. I think what you may be getting at is how we judging the past, aren't we, and how we apply this, what we should think about this, and I think it's a very difficult issue, because on the one hand, we obviously find a lot of the things they say completely unacceptable and even disgusting and so on. But on the other hand, they aren't always defined just by their views on race. I mean, Galton, after all, for instance, invented fingerprinting. So, they have, if you like, another life outside their racial views. And I think it's really very difficult to know how to deal with judging people in that sort of thing. I mean, in a way, a lot of assumptions about race are so, are not just individual, they are in the whole society, and the teaching. People are taught these things from beginning, and you find, I mean, one of the things I discovered in a library in London was a whole lot of addresses to schools, Victorian ones, in which, you know, pupils were exhorted to be worthy members of the Anglo-Saxon race. I mean, if you're brought up on that day in, day out, you're bound to pick up some of these views. And I think it's very hard to, you know, judge people in those sort of situations. Having said that, there are obviously deep-seated racists who, you know, define themselves by racism, like Thomas Carlyle, who are, you know, clearly, you know, very bad people, put it that way. But I think posthumous judgment is hard, and we need to think very carefully how we do this. I mean, in some ways, the title was intended as a provocation, which it obviously has worked in the sense that, you know, it's caught your attention. But I'm not in any way saying race is everything myself. Not at all, but it's simply description to some extent of a lot of the attitudes expressed by the people I'm writing about.
Thank you so much, David, for your lecture, and especially you bringing up Josiah Nott really reminded me of Drew Gilpin Faust's beautiful book on the ideology of pro-slavery and how contradictory it was in terms of its science and then the theology behind it.
Yes.
But my question is actually, we learned so much about Frederick Douglass's incredibly modern understanding of using photography in portraying images and construction of self and influencing public opinion. And I was just wondering, there were also all these other daguerreotype photographies of, you know, middle-class African Americans projecting, you know, respectability and dignity in the museum that we saw. But I was wondering, was there ever sort of a concerted effort on the side of abolitionists in the early and mid-19th century to basically use not photography, but art, paintings, portraits, to create images for the cause in terms of, you know, images of black people that would transport the sense of their dignity and humanity, and would therefore stand as statements against slavery too? Was there ever a movement of artists that created art for this purpose?
I mean, there are a few from the abolition campaigns in the 18th century. George Morland and Blake, to some extent, was expressed anti-slavery ideas. But I wouldn't say it was a movement. And I think there's the interesting thing is in caricature, which was again used extensively, and there are a few pro-abolition caricatures, but the people who were often behind abolitionism in England anyway, were often quite opposed to the visual arts, and so often it's the pro-slavery lobby tends to do more of the produce more caricatures. I think it really has to wait until the 20th century when you get black artists themselves who are professional artists who are beginning to think about how they can counteract what's going on, and they do this in lots of fascinating ways. And if you, slight plug here for the 20th century volume of The Image of the Black in Western Art, is very much devoted to black artists defining their own image in the 20th century. And there, I think it's fair to say you do get a movement that's concerned to to emphasize the subjectivity of black people quite distinctively, but not always in a preachy way at all, or in an obvious way, but in a more subtle way.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I've been looking at this portrait that I believe is also the cover of your book.
Yes.
And so I'd like to know a little more about it and why you chose it for the cover, as well as some of the other art we can expect to see in your book.
Well, this is a portrait by Géricault, great early 19th century French artist, of his model. It's called Joseph, and it's in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. It's one of the paintings that Dominique de Menil talks about, because one of the ambitions behind the series was to find images that, cut away from the master-slave relationship into one of common humanity. And this, I think, would fit very well with that ideal, because it does show someone who's clearly perceived in a fully human way and not stereotyped. And it is a portrait. I think there's a real difference between something that is a formal portrait and something where you've just got someone in a picture. And the fact that it is an individual portrait is in itself a sign of respect and of equal relations. And the very few of these paintings, the other one that I would think of is the great Velasquez in Metropolitan Museum in New York of Juan de Perea, his assistant. And there are a few of these paintings that stand out, and so that's what it is anyway. And I think it's an extremely moving picture in itself.
And so some other artwork that we might expect to see in your book?
Well, yes. Well, there's quite a lot in it, yes. Not always very pleasant images, I'm afraid, but there's quite a lot. It's got about 100 illustrations. So, but that would be the most sympathetic of them all, I think.
Thank you, David, for this insightful presentation. I have a rather selfish question in the sense that it's something that I'm researching right now for my second chapter of my book. I'm trying to trace or look information on the origins of the intellectual justification underpinning the transatlantic slave trade, which by the 17th century was well established in the Iberian world. And many scholars argue, like David Brown Davis, James Sweet, many others, that there is an intellectual current of anti-black racism that can trace back to the Muslim world during the peak of the trans-Saharan slave trade that reached the Iberian Peninsula by the time the Muslims took over the Iberian Peninsula. And by the time the transatlantic slave trade took off, those ideas were already circulating. But David Brown Davis traced the origin to the Muslim world. The first more openly, and I have read some of these Muslim scholars, and the most openly anti-black racists that you could read pretty much in Alabama in the 19th century are pretty similar in the language and description, were already formulated. So my question is, A, what do you think about that argument, if you have encountered before in your research? And second, if that's the case or not, and it seems to be different opinions about these transmission ideas, have you seen, or what is the representation of blackness in the Muslim world in pre-Renaissance Mediterranean realm?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I think the first part, I really don't have much to contribute, really. But the second part on representation, I mean, there are some in the volume on the image of the black in Africa and Asia. There's, and you will find some imagery there, but I can't think of it, immediately put my hands on anything, really. I mean, I think the whole question of the primacy of Muslim in the slave trade is a very interesting one, and it certainly precedes European slavery of Africans. But that whole mechanism is, I think, very specialized, and I don't really have any particular insight into that, I'm afraid.
Okay.
No.
David, this is mainly an excuse to thank you for what is an absolutely fascinating lecture. You drew so many different things together, and they made so much sense hearing you. My question is a strange one. From British art, how did you get into race? And was that? And are you the originator of, Petrie and Galton's? Are you the one who really brought it out into the open? Galton, Petrie, and is it a University College London thing? Or
No. It's the person who wrote the books, Debbie Chalice. Wrote a very good book a few years ago, and she was a curator in the Petrie Museum, which is, by the way, a fabulous museum, of course, as you know. But then how did I get into it? Well, I suppose it goes back to the 80s when I became very interested in representation and stereotyping and caricature, and I did an exhibition at the British Museum on called Shadow of the Guillotine, which was about English views of the French, and I got obviously very excited by all these extraordinary and often quite horrible images of French in all sorts of forms, and then on the strength of that, I suppose, I was asked by Professor David Friedberg, who's now at was a colleague of mine, and who's now at Columbia. And he apparently the Image of the Black series had got into difficulties. The 5 volumes had come out, but the volumes between 1500 and 1800 had not. And the editor that time was unable to find anyone to do it. So Dominique de Menil approached David Friedberg indirectly and said, well, can you put together a group of people to finish the 3 volumes? And I was invited to do the 18th century volume. I had no connection with, this sort of subject at all at that point, except through my interest in stereotyping and caricature. And then when I looked at it, it seemed, my God, this is fantastic, fascinating, and so I accepted and have not looked back really since then. It's, yeah.
David, thank you so much for this talk. As someone who's not in fields of history or art, I'm just really excited by what I'm learning, and I'm grateful for your contribution today. You indicated that the depiction, are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, I am, yes.
That the depiction of Black folks taught the field and other artists essentially how to interpret and how to continue some of those works going forward. And some of the questions you've been asked have skated towards what I'm going to ask, but haven't hit directly. I'm curious how those depictions impacted Black people themselves, and in what ways, if your research has unearthed ways that Black people looked at those images and felt themselves, that stereotype, or even, as you were indicating, as this person is sitting for this type of art painting, like, is there something that would that make them want to sit? Would they feel like the depictions of people prior to him have been so distorted, so stereotyped, that he wouldn't even want to be a part of this? So I'm just curious if there's anything about the psyche that's come up in your research.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that paintings like this are very rare, unusual, and what they all seem to come down to is a personal relationship between the painter and the sitter. And that seems very much the case with Velázquez's Juan de Pareja, and Juan de Pareja was a slave. He was actually Velázquez's slave, and Velázquez freed him, had him, manumitted. And he then became a professional painter himself, and they're really quite good. And there's an exhibition recently at the Metropolitan Museum. In the case of Géricault, we know he was fervently anti-slavery, and he did a number of other works. And he seems to have had and he put Joseph in quite a few of the paintings, and he seems to have had quite a personal relationship there with him, of genuine friendship. And that, of course, cuts against, the sort of all the other pressures. But in the question of black responses to these paintings, it's almost impossible to know until really the 19th century. I mean, in the 19th century, you get a flood of horrendous racist imagery caused by the fact that it became much cheaper and easier to make images through lithography and other technologies. And at that point, the society is literally, swamped by images that, linger on. For instance, Uncle Ben's rice is, I think, the last survivor of, what was it? And Aunt Jemima's pancakes. All this stuff, which is just pouring out in all sorts of forms. And I went to an exhibition at the Schomburg Center in New York, and it was room after room of horrible images from all countries in Europe and the US. So we know that people didn't like those at all. They're disgusting. And of course, Frederick Douglass is the one who responds in the most cogent way to these things, and he hated these images. And you may say even he devoted his life to counteracting them, and that's why he had himself photographed, and why Du Bois had his people photographed, was to counteract this flood of images that infiltrated everything. You couldn't buy a bar of soap without it having some racist imagery on it. It's overwhelming. So I think there's no doubt that was, and so Frederick Douglass is the first to think of a way of directly counteracting that. But I think even he knew he couldn't really do much against this flood of imagery and everything everywhere else. But of course, in the 20th century, it's been a big preoccupation of artists. Famous image of Aunt Jemima with a gun. All of these are all direct responses to this kind of flood of imagery. It's interesting. It's only really in the last few years that it's almost gone. The Aunt Jemima pancakes, I think, are still sold, aren't they? I don't know. But the Mammy image on the original Aunt Jemima, it was a minstrel song of the Aunt Jemima. The original Aunt Jemima was a white male singer in drag and blackface, singing about the joys of old Virginia. It just beggars belief, really. But
last two questions, Susan and then Dolores.
I was actually going to respond to your excellent point. So if somebody would like to go first and then to keep it up with David, I would love to do that at the end.
I can go next because My question is very related. I'm thinking a lot about cultural memory and the mythologies associated with, let's say, nationalism and white supremacy and racial differences. And you gave many examples, but you did not talk in depth about the origin of the correlation between the skull of Apollo and the skull of some of the people that were depicted as white and intelligent. Can you go a little more in depth about the interdisciplinary aspect of Apollo showing up as this figure to represent whiteness in the 19th century?
Yes, well, I mean, it goes back to the belief that the ultimate civilization was the ancient Greek ones, and that these works, ideal sculptures of the ancient Greeks, were the standard by which any art should be judged. So they have enormous prestige. And then, but of course, it requires a number of leaps that really aren't very logical, really, which is, first of all, that there is this correlation between the appearance, this ideal appearance, and some sort of ideal European form, which has no obvious basis at all. And as I said, we don't, as far as we know, the ancient Greeks did not see themselves as European or as white. But that's something that's picked up, and you begin to get it in the 16th century onwards, but taken up very much and very strongly in the early 19th century, the idea that that whiteness is then associated with the white marble of these works, of these original Greek works, which of course now we know that most of them were actually painted anyway. They weren't white originally. And then, of course, you've got the idea of descent comes in, and there was a strong belief that, that among nationalist Germans in the 19th century, that they were actually directly descended from the ancient Greeks, on the grounds that they were both civilized and a warrior people as well. I mean, the Greeks were celebrated as great artists, but also as great warriors. So they become the archetype for German emulation. And the whole idea of gymnasium and all these German schools and everything, and to some degree in England too, is based on a Greek ideal. And that's very powerful, and it permeates everything, and it conveys not only military supremacy, but also cultural superiority as well.
Final comment on this, John?
Yeah, it was a really important point that you raised around the potential links with Islam and Arabic and this discussion. And I come at this as somebody who works in sub-Saharan Africa, and in part on these connections. And I would say, first of all, there were a lot of people from sub-Saharan Africa, from what is today Senegal and Mali and Burkina Faso and elsewhere, who went north across the Sahara, or were taken north across the Sahara into Andalusia as part of the military, builders, tradesmen, craftsmen, etc. And in the construction of some of these ideas around race, yes, at certain points in time and in certain contexts, you do get racial differentiation. But I think it's complicated in part by what's happening outside of the text. So in Morocco, for example, you get particular groups of builders skilled in earthen architecture that become more closely associated with some of the sub-Saharan groups. And you get, meaning with a what we might say today is a kind of race-linked identity, but it's more lineage-linked. Same with musicians. And at the same time, what's happening in part in Andalusia and elsewhere in Europe that we have to bear in mind is, in principle, this is one generation of enslavement. So many of the women are working in families, many of the men are working within the context of particular craft guilds and otherwise, unlike what happens in the Americas, where race becomes in perpetuity as a factor of legal disenfranchisement and issues around slavery. So it's a quite different thing in terms of not only where people are living and the context of how all of this is playing out, and even more so because race is not the key factor in places like Mali in terms of political hierarchy, religion, and otherwise. Mali, and I'm just using that for sub-Saharan Africa in particular, but also connections to the north.
So for our fellows, there are books for you already on the lunch table.
Oh, you've given them the book?
Yes, of course.
Wow, fantastic.